rather than the chat. And I'm not sure whether you wanted to start with some of those questions from yesterday, but you know.
Well, actually, first of all, yes, I wanted to just say a word about our protocol and get to that question. But first, I want to thank everyone for joining us here. It is there we go. I want to see what I look like. I want to thank everyone for joining us. It's an honor to be able to address this material with you, with so many of you, and it's a pleasure for me. I want to say a word about that in just a moment. I realize something has happened in my reading, but it is a real pleasure for me to realize that there's such a community of EGS interested participants, and it's a pleasure to join with that community, and I look forward to our pursuing this kind of event in other ways as we go forward in the summer. Of course, there are the upcoming sessions. First of all, at the end of July and August. And I did want to say a word about that, to touch again upon the fact that what's happening now is somewhat different from what will happen in the seminars in this coming session. The reason for that is that we had expected to, I said this yesterday, but I returned to it. We had expected to be testing today our online platform with the webinar, in order to become familiar with it and learn the ins and outs and see some of the technical challenges or advantages. And when we announced the seminar, we did not expect quite such a large number of participants. So suddenly we were faced with a situation where there couldn't be a normal kind of engagement with 15 to 25 people. If that were the case, I would have you on the screen, and we would have the opportunity for exchange and some visual contact anyway. So I did want to mention that as we go forward, the seminars will be more like seminars, at least in the sessions, and there will be this, I think, a greater presence of the participants. At the moment, that's just not possible because of the great number. And the fact that not all of you are joining with the webinar. Some of you are going via the live stream on our YouTube channel. You're seeing the same thing. It's the same experience, but again, it doesn't allow for the kind of participation that I think a seminar can offer. So just that word about the immediate presentation. And regarding the questions, yes, I had a chance to see the questions that came in on the chat yesterday, or the Q&A rather, to remember Pirouz's words about how to proceed. The questions on the whole are, they address topics that I'll be coming to. So I think that I won't pause this morning to address them. I'll hope that they are becoming addressed as we go forward, and perhaps we can then return to some issues in the session devoted to the Q&A, which is the day after tomorrow at the same time. Now, I want to go back to something I said. I would be I'd be most grateful for questions that offer perspectives, and perhaps even readings or approaches, more than questions about technical or theoretical points. Again, I'm not trying to offer here today an interpretation of the play, or an interpretation of the authors I want to touch upon. In this case, Heidegger and Lacan and Blanchot. Well, there will of course be interpretation, but that's sort of not the point. I'm not interested in trying to establish theoretical points. What I want to do is try to create this resonance to which I referred yesterday, to try to let this play and the problems that speak to us from this play today to let that resonate in the moment, and to perhaps allow that to provoke thinking on our part, all our parts, in our separate locations. So so in that respect, I'm saying, yeah, when you do the Q&A, develop your thoughts. Please develop your thoughts, and I'll respond as I can. But please allow this as an opportunity to think with us, to bring forward some thoughts. So just one last note, Nemanja Mitrovic, I understand, has made available the translation from which I've been reading, translation of Antigone. This is the Wyckoff translation. And as I was saying yesterday, I think that in dealing with this play, one really must traverse a number of translations and try to, whenever possible, to the extent that one is able to, consult with the Greek or commentary on the Greek, which will help one really come to grips with the extreme difficulty of this early Sophoclean language. Some commentators think this is the most archaic of tragic writing that Sophocles offers us. Archaic in a sense that, well, La Coulebaute developed. Archaic in the sense that it is more Greek than modern in relation to the schema that Holden sets up for the ancients and the moderns. But in any case, the language is extremely challenging, and there is no such thing as a correct translation. There's no such thing as a correct translation because of the sheer enigmatic difficulty of the Greek, but also for reasons that I think Heidegger touches upon very powerfully, as did Benjamin. Translation engages something more than a proper determination of the meaning of words along dictionary senses. Rather, there's something about how in this case, a poet engages the language and engages the language itself, and that has to be brought forth in a translation. In a translation that's sensitive to the translator's own language and makes that language resonate with what is being translated. So translation here becomes an extremely important question and problem, and so just for that reason, I want to urge you, if you are pursuing this play, to consult many translations. Or I just want to acknowledge, I can't pretend to give you the right translation here, even using someone as graceful as Elizabeth Wyckoff. Okay, with that said, then let me get to the play and continue with the reading that I was pursuing yesterday. I said that my reading shifted a little bit. I found myself, as a result of the presentation yesterday, I found myself reflecting on this passage that we're coming to now, where Antigone appears in that splendor that has so moved so many commentators. And just a phrase came to my mind. I was thinking, Antigone seems much more human here. And it's a kind of a trite phrasing, but there's something of her intransigence falls away. And we see her in lamentation. We see her also in doubt. And the tone of it shifts quite profoundly. And so the nature of her engagement in this act that I was describing yesterday, I was talking about a public act, which she demands that Ismene recognize. I want you to denounce me, as she says. The nature of the engagement in that act is now, well, she falls away from that. And it's that falling or that going down that is now the focus of the play, and it is quite beautiful and quite powerful. And I think it makes me want to think a little bit more about this passage between this
commitment to this act of philia that she undertakes, which is in the name of death, as I said. And then this lamentation, which is in which she is still going to death, but doing it in how should I say, in lamentation. And so there is a quite significant shift going on. And what I would like to suggest, I think, is that, and I'm not suggesting anything new here, but I think I understand a little bit more, that we are now traversing the moment of catharsis in the play. And I'll try to just illustrate that a little bit with some words from Hölderlin. First, let us get into the play, and then I'll try to suggest why I've used this word catharsis. So I very quickly evoked the confrontation between Haman and Creon. I pointed to that line. I think it's it's got to be about 7:45, where Haman says, "You tread down the gods' due. Respect is gone." And I suggested with Hölderlin that the play really turns at this point. At this point, there is a judgment about Creon that has crystallized. And I think that we can hear behind it the people for whom Haman is speaking. This is anyway how I hear this line. It is a very powerful statement at that point. Hölderlin will say everything turns at this point. Haman, of course, rushes off when Creon proposes to have Antigone killed before his eyes. And at that point, the chorus says, "Okay, what will you do now?" And Creon says, "Both of them will go to death." And they say, "Both?" And Creon says, "No, you're right, just the one." So Creon delivers the condemnation in a I mean, it sounds almost delirious in its force. "Take her where the foot of man comes not, there shall I hide her in a hollowed cave, living, and leave her just so much to eat as clears the city from the guilt of death. There, if she prays to death, the only God of her respect, she may manage not to die, or she may learn at last, and even then, how much, too much, her labor for the dead." It's a resentful, extremely resentful act at this point. And as I said, almost delirious. This will clear the city from the guilt of death. And obviously, this is not happening at all. The chorus breaks in at this point, and it's a sort of a remarkably, it's a broken moment, it seems to me, because the chorus starts off with a reflection on Eros, love who falls on our havings, you rest in the bloom of a girl's unwithered face. And it seems to be speaking to Haman's reaction to the loss of his bride, and the extremity of his response to Creon. But immediately, and this is also, it's interesting perhaps because this gives us a clear distinction between Eros and the Philia that we've been reading, or anyway, I wouldn't say a clear distinction, but the two are something of a contrast here. But the chorus is only about 10 lines into this when Antigone is brought in under guard. And at that point, the chorus says, "Now I'm carried beyond all bounds, carried beyond the limits. My tears will not be checked. I see Antigone depart to the chamber where all men sleep." So they come apart, right? In tears. And we might want to remember that as Antigone repeats over and over in the coming lines, "I go unwept to my death." Antigone is in a completely different space. But the chorus is in tears. And Antigone then begins, "Men of my father's land, you see me go my last journey, my last sight of the sun, then never again. Death, who brings all to sleep, takes me alive to the shore of the river underground. Not for me was the marriage hymn, nor will anyone start the song at a wedding of mine. Achon is my fate, my mate, excuse me." Chorus says, with praise as your portion, you go in fame to the vault of the dead, untouched by wasting disease, not paying the price of the sword of your own motion, you go alone among mortals. Will you descend in life to the house of death? And throughout this passage now we hear over and over this motif of an impossible crossing, crossing into death, which Antigone is undertaking alive, unlike any other mortal, as they say. It's actually hard to conceive in a certain sense. She will descend in life to the house of death. Yes, she will be living as she goes into the tomb and then will be taken in death. But they phrase it quite powerfully. You will go in life to the house of death. Antigone then comes out with words that are quite famous. And this is where I will pick up with Helen in a moment. Pitiful was the death that stranger died, our queen once, Tantalus's daughter. The rocket covered her over like stubborn ivy. It grew still as she wastes, the rain and snow companion her. Pouring down from her morning eyes comes the water that soaks the stone. My own putting to sleep a god has planned like hers. So Antigone, in facing this passage, this crossing, I'm going to be taking up the theme of journeying as I talk about Heidegger. As she undertakes this crossing, she compares herself to a goddess turned to stone, and this becoming stone-like is her extraordinary image for this passing she's undertaking. Of course, God's child and God she was. We are born to death. So the course seems almost to correct her a little bit. She was a child of a god, and she was a god. We are born to death. And they underscore in this way Antigone's extraordinary position, as which she is described and they are describing. Yet even in death, you will have your fame to have gone like a god to your fate, in living and dying alike. So again, they underscore this coming together of life and death that is happening in this passage that Antigone is undertaking. And they give her extraordinary praise. You go like a god to your death, but you go as a mortal. And that is not a mocking statement, it seems to me. On the contrary, and yet she takes it that way. Laughter against me now. In the name of our fathers, gods, could you not wait till I went? Must affront be thrown in my face? There, again, it's, as I said a moment ago, I don't hear mocking in the chorus. Antigone is in a completely different space, and she shows this extraordinary, almost arrogance at this point. But it's not arrogance, it's just a kind of sovereignty in her distress and her solitude, in her sense of abandon. And so she pronounces these extraordinary words. O city of wealthy men, I call upon Dioce's spring, I call upon Thebes' grove in the armored plain to be my witnesses, how with no friends mourning, by what decree I go to the fresh made prison tomb, alive to the place of corpses, an alien still, never at home with the living, nor with the dead. And she evokes this impossible place, this impossible stage, this traversal that she is undertaking between life and death, and she calls herself an alien. Metoikos, excuse me. And I had that wrong. She is again in passage as an alien, and neither at home nor in either place with the dead or the living. Again, this is very important for what Heidegger is saying about the becoming homely and unhomely of Antigone. Chorus, you went to the furthest verge of daring, but there you found the highest foundation of justice and fell. Perhaps you are paying your father's pain. Daring picks up the early statement in the Ode about human daring at the limits of the polis. And then they evoke something that unnerves or unsettles or touches upon Antigone's. And she says her darkest thought. You speak of my darkest thought, my pitiful father's fame, spread through all the world, and the doom that haunts
our house, the royal house of Thebes, my mother's marriage bed. Destruction where she lay with her husband's son, my father. These are my parents and I their child. I go to stay with them. My curse is to die unwed. My brother, you found your fate when you found your bride. Found it for me as well. Dead, you destroy my life. The evocation of the fathers of the family Ate and the fathers, the legacy of the father in this case, Oedipus, is striking to me because it's as though she's acknowledging at this point that she has been swept by something, right? That perhaps is beyond her autonomous action thus far. I mean, she will be described by the chorus in a few moments as autonomos, and that's the way it's being referred to. You're acting on your own in a way that is she insists it's impracticable. You attempt to do the impossible from the outset. This she can't follow. But she's accusing Antigone at that point again of being autonomos, which is what the chorus will say in condemning her. You might say her tragic act. But immediately, Antigone is starting to. She speaks here, and she increasingly is speaking in doubt. And the doubt, I think I'm hearing something. The doubt partially comes from the fact that she senses that she has been swept by this doom that haunts our house. The chorus sort of almost reassures her, but they touch upon this tragic act of hers. You showed respect for the dead. This echoes Haman. So we for you, we're not mocking you, but power is not to be thwarted. So your self-sufficiency has brought you down. That's the evocation of her being autonomous. Antigone, again, in another space, unwept, no wedding song, unfriended. This is Philia again. Now I go the road laid down for me. No longer shall I see this holy light of the sun. No friend to bewail my fate. No friend. Again, the notion is she's calling upon Philos, and there is no friend. Of course, Ismene is nearby. The citizens are all nearby. The citizens are in tears. They have come to acknowledge the glory of her act. And she claims solitude. Solitude and she has already told us once, I go unwedded to the tomb. I go without friends, without mourning. But again, she underscores, I go without having known marriage and the possibility of a child, children. I really feel the limits of my understanding of the Greek background here, because I want to ask, what is marriage exactly for Antigone? What can it be for her? What is she evoking at this point? There is a kind of recollection of what has just unfolded with Haman. Of course, she was to be married to Haman, and poor Haman. I mentioned yesterday, he seems almost to have a somewhat abstract quality in this play. She never refers to him in the first half, and even here, she's not referring to the loss of my beloved fiancé, who has, who will be dying with her. No mention at all of Haman, but the lamentation turns around this question of, in part, turns around this question of marriage. Now that point makes me want to, it puts another perspective for me on the coming justification that she's going to offer for her acts. First, in response to this reference to a lack of friends who will mourn her, Creon says, let's get on with it. Take her, let her choose when she gets to this tomb, death or a buried life. Again, no stain of guilt upon us in this case, but she is exiled. There again is the reference to her being alien in this passage. She is exiled from our life on earth. Antigone, O tomb, O marriage chamber, marriage, I hollowed out house that will watch forever where I go to my own people who are mostly there. And she names those that she served in Philia. Persephone has taken them to her. Last of them all, ill-fated past the rest, shall I descend. Again, Ismene is completely excluded. Before my course is run. Still, when I get there, I may hope to find I come as dear friend, here's Philia again, dear friend to my dear father, to you, my mother, and my brother too. All three of you have known my hand in death. She really is emphasizing at this point that her bond with them has to do with the fact that she performed the rites and washed them with her hands. I washed your bodies, dressed them for the grave, poured out the last libation at the tomb. Last, Polynices knows the price I pay for doing final service to his corpse, and yet the wise will know my choice was right. And this is where she pronounces the strange justification for her choice of burying Polynices or giving the funeral rites. She says, after saying the wise will know that I was right. Had I had children, or their father dead, I'd let them molder. I should not have chosen in such a case to cross the state's decree. It's a strange statement. This is one who has committed herself to her kinship bonds in Philia thus far, and is now saying, well, if it came to a husband or the children that I might have with that husband, I wouldn't go so far as to cross the state's prerogatives. But, and she goes on, why? Well, what law lies behind these words? One husband gone, I might have found another, or a child from a new man in first child's place. But with my parents hid away in death, no brother ever could spring up for me. Such was the law by which I honored you. But Creon thought the doing was a crime, a dreadful daring, brother of my heart. So now he takes and leads me out by force. No marriage bed, no marriage song for me. And since no wedding, so no child to rear. I go without a friend, struck down by fate, live to the hollow chambers of the dead. So it is a very strange argument. In fact, it's so strange that the very distinguished commentators have excluded it from the play. I'm referring, the most famous perhaps is Sir Richard Jebb, who did an important edition and translation. They just declare this is not worthy of Sophocles. This couldn't have been Sophocles. We just have to remove this. And yet every manuscript has this. Aristotle refers to the passage. It's most unlikely that it's not part of this play by Sophocles' hand. But it's strange. And my own reaction has been over the years to say, well, yes, in this state of extremity that she's in, to offer any kind of justification in relation to the unwritten laws that she has followed up to this point in an absolute way will lead her to these kinds of incoherencies. It will lead her into this, well, no argumentation could suffice, right? No justification in terms of some logical or rational choice in this act. No, she's answering a law that is more primordial than anything that could be rationally accounted for, at least as she told us before. And so these words are kind of strikingly inadequate in relation to what she has done before. Now, Lacan will give an interesting response to this, and I'll come back to that. I'll come to that tomorrow. So I won't try to comment on his attempt to make sense of this word. He thinks it's perfect sense. I understand exactly what this is about, and I don't want to contest that either. But it's but what I'm struck by is again the inconsequence of these words, the lack of well, or at least the extraordinary distance that has been taken in relation to the previous act of philia. And in that respect, I'm struck by the way in which this is framed with the question of marriage. Right? She said she is lamenting the lack of marriage, and then she comes up with this justification, which alludes to, if I were married, if I had children, well, I wouldn't do what I did before. And so it's and that what I want to say, that consideration is utterly abstract at this point. It's or abstract in the sense there will be no marriage, there will be no children. So this consideration of what might have been, again, strikes me as abstract for that reason. So I'm only teasing here at. I'm trying to get to a sense of the condition she's in at this point, of where she stands at this moment. Before, she stood in a place of absolute destitution, of ruin. She's occupying the limit of the familiam ate and acting absolutely in relation to these unwritten laws in the name of philia. As I said, she acts for the dead in the name of death. Here, she has come to another place. It's a place of lamentation. The chorus is crying around her. She is transported, hence that image of Niobe, hence her relation to the chorus. And so she's in an extraordinary distance in relation to the others. She's in a kind of solitude, but it's not the same solitude as she was in before, it seems to me, or something has shifted. And then she has these words, which these are the last ones that I'll pause over. I just read, I go without a friend, struck down by fate, live to the hollow chambers of the dead. What divine justice have I disobeyed? Why, in my misery, look to the gods for help? Can I call any of them my ally? I stand convicted of impiety, the evidence my pious duty done. Should the gods think that this is righteousness, in suffering, I'll see my error clear. But if it is the others who are wrong, I wish them no greater punishment than mine. She finishes with a flourish of let them suffer no more than I'm suffering. But nevertheless, there seems to have been, there's a note of doubt there. It could be that she's saying, given the gods to whom I have appealed and the unwritten law, there will be no, I cannot turn to the city's gods. I cannot turn to the, let's just say the everyday. The customs of the everyday as recognized in the polis. But I think that there's perhaps a more fundamental doubt at stake here. Again, because she has been acting in the name of something that is beyond anyone's knowledge or hold. She has a kind of knowledge of that law, but it's certainly not something that could then be translated into rational terms. Okay, so I have been, I'm how should I say, I'm teasing at something there. I'm trying to get at something I feel in the transformation of her stance and her stature. Her stature is now, she appears godlike, as the chorus has told us. She is awesome in her presence, and in that solitary condition in which she stands in this passage between life and death, an alien to the city and still to death, in this state of passing, in this crossing, at this liminal place where life and death are now confused. But she is in, as I say, she's in a state of lamentation as she does that. And she's remembering her father's doom. So this was, in thinking about this, I was then reminded again of Holonym, who describes, who doesn't hesitate in reading both Antigone and Oedipus to call upon the Aristotelian motif of catharsis to talk about what is happening before us. And I'm inclined to think that what we have just read is the moment for a learning of catharsis. Now, I say that, I'm inclined to think that because actually his remarks on Oedipus and Antigone can be extremely obscure at certain points. And, you know, it's very difficult to conclude at least on some central issues. But nevertheless, there's a very powerful understanding of what's happening in the tragic configuration. And Holonym defines this for us twice. Once in the remarks on Oedipus, and then again in the remarks on Antigone. He gives us a kind of overall account of what he calls the metaphor of the tragic, metaphor, carrying across. He speaks of the tragic as a metaphor, and here the metaphor has to do with a kind of separation. He defines the tragic in the following way, and Holonym is writing at a moment, I know many of you are well familiar with this, but Holonym is writing at a moment when something like a philosophy of the tragic is being elaborated. And for this, I would urge you to take a look at the work of Pirooz. And Heidegger, I don't know if I'm going to have much time to talk about this, but Heidegger himself is taking up this philosophy of the tragic in his own thinking about existence. But Holonym is giving a quite powerful voice to this, and I'm reading from the section 3. This is in the Fau translation of the Essays and Letters on Theory by Holonym. It's an impossible sentence. I'll have to read it twice for you, but it goes as follows. This is the definition of the tragic, of the presentation of the tragic. He says, the presentation of the tragic, here it's Darstellung, as I remember, the presentation of the tragic rests primarily on the tremendous. Here, you might want to translate as monstrous, ungeheuer. It is, and this is partly what Heidegger will be translating as uncanny. The presentation of the tragic rests primarily on the tremendous, and he defines the tremendous, how the God and man mate, and how natural force and man's innermost boundlessly unite in wrath. That's the tremendous. Sorry, and I have to reread the sentence to pick up then the second half. The presentation of the tragic rests primarily on the tremendous conceiving of itself. Self-conception. This is the concept. Right? He's very close to Hegel at this moment. This is using the term concept in that sense. The presentation of the tragic rests primarily on the tremendous conceiving of itself, rests on the boundless union, purifying itself through boundless separation. This act of self-conception, which is an act of self-conception on the part of the tremendous, he says, is a separating purification. And immediately he cites Aristotle, or he cites a reference to Aristotle, which tells us, at least tells us who he's reading. He goes on in that section 3 and on Oedipus, he says, he describes the scene. He says, thus, in the core scenes of Oedipus, the lamenting, the peaceful, and the religious, the pious lie, and to the degree of utmost exhaustion, the compassion for a dialogue which will tear apart the soul of just these listeners with its wrathful sensitivity. In the scenes, the frightfully festive forms, the drama like an auto da fe, as language for a world where under pest and confusion of senses, and under universally inspired prophecy in idle time of plague, with the God and man expressing themselves in the all-forgetting form of an infidelity, for divine infidelity is best to retain.
so that the course of the world will not show any rupture and the memory of the heavenly ones will not expire. He's talking about the way in which humankind turns against the divine, but in order to preserve a relation to the divine. That's what he calls infidelity. What he will tell us now, it's the piety of the traitor. At such moments, man forgets himself and the God and turns around like a traitor, naturally in saintly manner. In the utmost form of suffering, namely, there exists nothing but the conditions of space and time. He's a reader of Kant, and he's giving us a rather extreme construction of how these transcendental conditions can be presented in the tragic work, dargestellt, in the tragic presentation. Inside it, man forgets himself because he exists entirely for the moment. God forgets himself because he is nothing but time. And not, either one is unfaithful. Time, because it is reversed categorically at such a moment, no longer fitting beginning and end. Crucial statement, right? Aristotle sees beginning and end brought into organic unity. Berlin says, no, it is a scission that creates an irreversible time. So beginning and end will no longer rhyme, as he puts it. God is unfaithful. Man, because at this moment of categorical reversal, he has to follow and thus can no longer resemble the beginning and what follows. Thus Haman in Antigone, thus Oedipus himself in the tragedy of Oedipus. Now I think he also sees Antigone in this condition, as we'll see. And I'm going to, actually, let me pick up that link immediately. In section 3 of the remarks on Antigone on page 113 in the file text, he comes back to the definition of tragedy, and he says, as has been hinted at in the remarks on Oedipus, the tragic representation has as its premise that the immediate God is all at one with man, fusion. For the God of an apostle, he goes on, is more immediate, is higher intellect and highest spirit. So let me pick up where I was. The tragic representation has as its premise that the immediate God is all at one with man, that the infinite enthusiasm conceives of itself infinitely, that is in consciousness which cancels consciousness, separating itself in sacred manner, and that the God is present in the figure of death. Consciousness canceled consciousness. Consciousness turns against itself at this point. And he is suggesting that in the initial stage, there's an enthusiasm where God and human mate, as he puts it, or couple come together in a kind of immediate relation. And that is something of what happens to Antigone in the opening part, in her enthusiasm, you might say, in her absolute commitment to her act of philia in response to this divine law. And then there is the moment of separation. And for Holonen, that separation is named when she refers to Niobe. I want to pick that up. Which I would just love to read one more of this. At page 110 in the second section, Holonen is commenting on Antigone's confrontation with Creon, talking about the way in which in the tragic event, there is this moment when the spirit is pulled into that immediate confrontation that he's describing. At that moment, he says, man in the tragic moment has to sustain himself the most, hence he is also most exposed in his character. He goes on, the tragic moderate weariness of time, whose object is ultimately not of interest to the heart, in other words, losing touch with the world of pragmatic relations, follows the onrushing spirit of time most intemperately, and the latter time appears intemperate then, not in that it spared mankind like a spirit at day, but it is relentless as the spirit of the eternally living, unwritten wasteland and of the world of the dead. Antigone has been answering to something of that spirit in what has preceded.
Creon, evil ones, though, are not to be considered like good ones. It's the distinction between enemy and friend. Antigone, who's to say? There may be a different usage down there. That's the sentence I told you that's so important to Heidegger. Ein anderer Brauch, a different usage. Hölderlin goes on, the amiable, the understanding in misfortune, the dreaming naive, the true language of Sophocles, since Aeschylus and Euripides know more how to depict suffering and wrath, yet less how to depict man's understanding as wandering below the unthinkable. Antigone does seem in the passage we're reading now to be wandering under the unthinkable. I skipped just a little bit here, and he comes now to Antigone's words where she compares herself to Niobe. This is again the point which I've been saying. Perhaps this is where we situate catharsis. The chorus is crying, right? It is collapsed, and she comes out with these words. So Creon says, "Not long will you brood under the jealous sun," and Hölderlin comments, on Earth, among mankind, the sun, as it becomes physically relative, can also become truly relative in a moral sense. And he goes on, or she goes on, I have heard that equal to the desert had become, and she's going into the passage about Niobe. This is Hölderlin's response, presumably the noblest trait of Antigone. To the extent that sacred madness is the highest human manifestation, and here more soul than language, the sublime mockery surpasses all her other statements. And it is also necessary to talk in the superlative of the beauty, again, this is what Lacan will pick up, because the attitude is, among other things, also based on the superlative of human spirit and heroic virtuosity. It is a great resource, Hölderlin goes on, of the secretly working soul that at the highest state of consciousness, it evades consciousness. That's that term we just read about. And that before the present God actually seizes it, the soul confronts him with bold, frequently even blasphemic word, and thus maintains the sacred living potential of the spirit. In a high state of consciousness, then, it always compares itself to objects that do not have any consciousness, yet which in their destiny assume the form of consciousness. One such object is land that has become desert, and so forth. And he will go on then to discuss the chorus's own description of the deities and heroes or victims of a confrontation with the divine. And I think that this is actually where I can pause now, because I'm going on a little bit longer than I thought I should. But it would appear that it's then, from what Hölderlin has just said, that when she makes this, when she gives these words, which she describes as her noblest, in which appear her noblest trait, and he goes on to talk about her heroic virtuosity and the beauty of her stance. This occurs precisely when she makes this comparison to Niobe, precisely at the moment when she's beginning her lament. And this is, Hölderlin says, the moment at which consciousness turns against consciousness, when that turns against itself and separates from the God. So that is the point of catharsis. That's the point of separation. That's where the concept of the uncanny is conceiving itself, as Hölderlin puts it in that obscure, speculative manner. But the point is that this is catharsis, and I think the release of tears, and also her lamentation, and her, as I put it in that simplistic way, her becoming more human, are all traits belonging to this cathartic moment in the play. It's catharsis is a very, very difficult concept, and I offer it only because I'm trying to come to grips with this this passage that I've been talking about. I'm not answering anything with this reference to catharsis, except insofar as that it does seem to the concept perhaps helps us to approach this transformation in Antigone's
stance, in her position. There is, in the history, I've written on catharsis. If anyone's interested, I wrote an essay on Aristotle's Poetics in the light of Holin's remarks. In the history of the concept of catharsis, for the past 30 years or so, since Gerald Else's contribution, catharsis has been understood pretty much formally. And that is to say, Else argued actually that catharsis happens in the play. It's not something that happens in the audience, or the audience participates in that, but it's something that is occurring in the play itself. Actually, that might be what we're seeing here, as I just tried to read this catharsis in this passage we've been reading. But that is again a very formalistic construction, in that it's and it will be taken over in a kind of literary formalism, in that the stress upon the formal traits of the organic structure of beginning, middle, and end, with the discovery and the peripeteia and so on and so forth, will be stressed as the ground of the cathartic event. But I think that this loses something of a hold on the more medical understanding of catharsis, and which was developed in Heidegger's, in Aristotle's, it's in the Rhetoric, as I remember, or the Polity. Forgive me, I can't remember the exact reference. I'll find that for tomorrow. But there is a sense of catharsis that has I think a more profound purgative sense, and this is a bit of what's occurring, or what Holinen is calling upon, even as he gives us a strictly formal construction of the tragic presentation. I say strictly formal because it's quite elaborate in its construction of the rhythmic character of the play. But okay. I've called upon it because it's because of the release of the chorus, Antigone's own release in some sense, and exposure to doubt and lamentation. Okay, and then the question for me is, how do we go from that relation to philia to this this state that she's in? I have been going a bit longer than I anticipated with the play, and I want to come next to what Heidegger contributes, which I think is actually of quite some interest. And in this case, actually, I'm going to answer a question that came in the Q&A. Ian Rowland asked about the nature of the philia and the act involved. Does it go beyond finitude? And this is something that I'm struggling with in Heidegger. So I don't want to push everybody away. I think there are other reasons for reading this, what we're going to look at. It's really a quite powerful account of the notion of the uncanny and the journeying to which I've been referring, this passing between life and death. And I think my own sense is that Heidegger fails to come to grips with this, even though he is almost insistently returning to it. As though he needs to return to this. And I'll come back to that, why he is going to this. And I'll try to suggest a little bit why I think he's just not able to approach what is speaking in the play that he is attempting to read. So give me about 7 minutes, and then we'll come back for the last part of this session. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll start again in 7 minutes from now. Yesterday we were thinking about playing music, but we recognized that the live stream would be stopped because of copyright infringement. So we're just gonna go in silence for a bit, and I'll keep popping in 3 or 4 minutes just for those that are joining and thinking suddenly there's something wrong with the stream. Okay, so see you in a few. For those of you just joining us or who have logged on to the live stream and are curious what's actually happening right now, we're currently on break for a couple more minutes. As of tomorrow, I'll create some kind of video with images and potentially communicate to some musicians I know so that we could play something during these times when we have breaks and not have the live stream shut down because of copyright infringement. So thank you all, and I hope everyone's safe, and I look forward to seeing everybody in Malta. We'll be starting in a few.
Pirooz, am I there?
Yeah, you're all set. Everything's good to go. So
Thank you.
I also had an idea for when we're on break next time to potentially play a video with some music that, you know, so we'll have to see who would provide it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that could be a big dispute, no? Good. So I took a moment, and as I was walking away from that, I was pursuing some improvised thoughts there. One thing struck me as, well, let's remember that there's more than one catharsis in this play. And there's another tragic figure, and that's Creon, and I won't be talking about that. But I remember Lacan's remark in reaction to Hegel, and I think it's in reaction to Hegel, and he says he's kind of making fun of Hegel's interpretation, and says, so Hegel thinks there's some sort of reconciliation at the end of this play. I'd like to see that. It's what would reconciliation possibly be? Maybe I'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow. But in any case, there's probably more than one catharsis. The other thing I was thinking is that I wish Slavoj were next to me as I try to link together this idea of a concept of the conception of tragedy, of the tragic event, entailing this separation whereby there is a cathartic event, and then this expression of doubt on Antigone's part, which is very much like the one of the Christ, Father, why have you abandoned me? I think we'd have something to talk about. Anyway, going forward, I wanted to, as I mentioned to you, I want to speak a bit about Heidegger's interpretations of Antigone. And I'd like to say just a couple words about the context for this, and then I'm going to move quickly through the first discussion, which he presented in 1935, and then move over to the discussion from 1942. I want to just say a word about what Heidegger is doing in turning to Antigone. The introduction to metaphysics was widely distributed and widely known, and also became a bit infamous because in there Heidegger talks about the grandeur or inner strength and greatness, I think he says, the phrase is escaping me now, of National Socialism. And he kept that phrase in the text, and this disturbed obviously a lot of readers. But it's not but, you know, there is already a very great deal to read about Heidegger's commitment to National Socialism and the movement in that text. Also his critique of that movement in relation to the what he was beginning to recognize as its utter involvement in what he would describe as technique, that technological term which defines modernity. One of the things he's struggling with in this moment is precisely the Nazi construction of science. And of course, for him as past rector, he understands science in a broad sense, and he sees the very meaning of the university as being at stake. He said this in 1929 when he talked about what the university is doing, and then when he assumed his role as rector. And so, but he's struggling, you know, quite fundamentally with the appeal to science and the construction of science, and all of that represents in terms of the modern metaphysics of the subject. And so, when he turns to pre-Socratics and to tragedy in the introduction to metaphysics, part of what he's doing is he's trying to negotiate the turn toward poetry and myth that he considers essential to any kind of recovery of what he's calling the human essence. Now, this is a very, very big problem for him, this question of the human essence, and that's why I think that the turn to Antigone is particularly important and also particularly fraught. Because Heidegger will tell us already in the next year, he writes the monumental essay on art and the origin of the work of art. And at the end of that, he adds an addendum that came after the war, but it's already quite visible in the text itself. He says that the relation between being and human being is unsuitably conceived here, unsuitably presented here. A distressing difficulty, he says, since the time of the existential analytic. A distressing difficulty. Now, I'll say this is exactly what the existential analytic is supposed to be about, the relation between human being and being. And right at the core, then, he has a major problem, and he's trying to struggle with this. The turn to poetry in 1935 is in part 1934 and 35, and that's a turn to Höllenen's river hymns, Germania and Der Rhein. The turn to poetry is in part an effort to come to grips with this question of the human essence from the basis of what a poetic saying can bring. And that's a particular relation to language, a particular use of language, and a particular experience of what language does in its saying of being. And Heidegger will in these years, he gives quite extraordinary role to poetry. I've been dealing with this for many, many years. But recently, since I've been trying to complete my work on is thinking about rhythm in poetry, I've been coming back to it, and I can't get over it. How powerful this appeal to poetry is, how important it is for him, and also how problematic it is. He goes very far in saying that a poetic thought is different from that of philosophy, and certainly different from any technical construction of the world, right? Any world building. I'm tempted to cite some Hölderlin, but I won't go into it. Heidegger is quite insistent on the singular character of poetic language for understanding what the human essence is and what it means to dwell on what he calls the earth. This topic also, I think, I think it's extremely important right now to try to understand what he's calling the earth, what it means, a poetic relation to the earth in this time of a cataclysm. And of course, all of you will recognize to what extent the current pandemic is linked to ecological conditions and a disorder, ecological disorder of a very profound kind. So I turn back to these texts of Heidegger with very questioning, very immensely problematic, but at the same time, I think there's some extremely, should I say, challenging thinking about what he calls the earth and our relation to it and what it means for human being, which he's trying to define, what it means for human being to dwell. The usual take on this from the basis of building dwelling thinking that we get from the early 50s and traverses architectural thinking and so forth. It's really a bit beside the point, I have to say. What Heidegger's calling dwelling is a much more radical concept. And that's what he's getting at in these readings of the Choral Ode and Antigone. He's trying to get at what it is to become homely, as he puts it. And becoming homely is to find a dwelling on earth for human beings. Now, I have to watch the time carefully. We don't have a lot of time left. I'll try to summarize more than I would have. I am talking about the introduction to metaphysics, and specifically the discussion of the Choral Ode in Antigone, which comes in Heidegger's text at page 156. We supplied the PDF for you in the Google Classroom, so you can look at this page 156. He cites the Choral Ode, which starts with the lines, "Manifold," as translated, "Manifold is the uncanny, yet nothing uncannier than man bestirs itself, rising up beyond him." Manifold is the uncanny. It comes in many forms, pola dainon. But there is nothing uncannier than man. And man is thereby, as Sophocles tells us, to danotaton, the most uncanny. Heidegger will analyze this ode in a rather summary way, but extremely, how could I say, inspiring. That word's too strong, but it's quite powerful, quite interesting. And his focus is on the question of the dainon. What is meant by dainon? And then what is meant by this relation between dainon, which characterizes physis, this overpowering quality of dainon, and the way in which human being turns this power against physis in order precisely to allow physis to appear in its being. And Heidegger's construction of this will be in tragic terms. Again, I think that I simply won't try to develop this with you, but let me point to it. It is in, I think it's page pages oh no, excuse me. Pages 171 and 172, where Heidegger describes the way in which human doing will, when it becomes properly human in the sense he's defining here, where the uncanny power of the human is deployed, and where a breach is opened, he says in Physis, whereby Physis can appear. He says that the one who undertakes this doing, and he says these are state creators, these are poets, these are builders, as he puts it. Those who undertake this go to the very limits of being and are destroyed in this event. And so it's a strictly tragic construction of human doing, which is again inspired by Sophoclean schema that's presented. I think that I'll just say one word more in summary about this and then turn to the 1942 version of this reading of the Choral Ode. Heidegger understands the uncanniness of the human to have a double character. This is one of the, I'd say, the beauties of his reading, because he catches the way in which the language in the ode is moving between extremes and is sometimes quite ambiguous in that movement. And so he's catching the play of a word like deinon between these extremes, and or even the play in the notion of what it is to be the uncanniest. And so he understands the uncanny essence of the human being to derive from the fact that humans have, by virtue of their capacity with language and their understanding, they have a relation to being as such. And in this tragic act by which they poetize or build or create a state, they are in this act transcending what is and bringing what is into definition. So the human being is a being that has a relation to being as such, that names being as such, and is thereby in a space of separation from being, and is absolutely distinctive in this space. And it's in that sense that they are the most uncanniest. And he will say they appropriate language itself, which is part of the overpowering sway in which they live, part of the deinon that is proper to Physis. They appropriate it for their own ends and use language even against itself and then against Physis for this tragic act. So on the one hand, but humans are, by virtue of their nature and in separation from being, their essence is one of an ecstatic being. And in this, they nevertheless find themselves sort of losing themselves in the pragmatic activities of the world. And this is what he called in the existential analytic, you'll all be familiar with this, inauthenticity. Human beings get caught up in their doings in the world and start to define themselves in relation to those doings and the things in the world. So they effectively forget their own essence. And this is what makes them, first of all, uncanny. They are uncanny because they don't know who they are and pursue their own destruction. Everywhere journeying, they come to nothing. They go out and try to find their way, and yet they constantly get mired in the pragmatic relations they've undertaken. So that is the uncanniness of forgetting. And on this basis, Heidegger will say in the 42 lectures, he says that the human being turns from its essence, and that in that, he takes the Greek, he says, the human being is catastrophic. It turns away from its being, and it is a catastrophe for that reason. And this is how Heidegger would understand our current occupation with the Anthropocene. The human being in this particular mode of uncanniness is a catastrophe for being. But there is another sense of uncanniness, which is that the human being has the capacity at the same time to remember a relation to its own essence. And this is what he will claim Antigone is doing, is undertaking. Antigone is in that way assuming uncanniness, and this is uncanniness. He develops this with the idea of being at home or heimisch, or not at home. She assumes a being not at home or a being uncanny in order to find a being homely or a being canny, if you will, in order to recover a relation to her own origin as a human being, and thereby to set the grounds for a proper relation to being, properly human relation to being. So Antigone is the most extreme in going to the limits, he will tell us, and at the same time, the purest in answering to her own ground in remembrance. So this is the other sense of uncanny. And what he will develop in the 1942 lectures, you can see I'm really coming to the end of my time. What he will develop in the 1942 lectures is the contradiction between these two forms of uncanny being, the inauthentic one, if you will, and then the authentic one that is Antigone, the extreme authentic one that is Antigone. He'll develop that, and then he will try to give an account of the nature of Antigone's, this act of remembrance, whereby she relates to her, the ground of her own being. There are some remarkable passages in the 1942 lectures, but I'm going to just remain at a, at the sort of a summary level at this point, and I will just read a couple passages tomorrow to get started, in which Heidegger starts to concentrate on the figure of Antigone. It's really quite astonishing. But let me just say a word about what he's doing again. I was speaking very generally with regard to the 1935 context, with his turn away from the political order that he served and embraced. And he was turning, as I said, to poetry. At the end of turning to poetry via Hölderlin again. Hölderlin, who is for Heidegger the poet of the poet, in that he not only goes the farthest in engaging poetry as a saying of being, as Heidegger would put it, he goes the farthest. He also goes the farthest in that act in giving us an account of the essence of poetry itself. So Hölderlin is poetizing the essence of poetry and the poet as he undertakes his poetic act. So Heidegger, in following Hölderlin, by 1942, he's increasingly preoccupied with the historical character of this poetic act. And so this is already visible in 1934 when he goes to the river hymns. He starts talking about destiny. And one can see that he's very sensitive to Hölderlin's own thinking about history in those texts, in the remarks in particular, and in some of the poetry. But the presence of the remarks remains somewhat, what could I say? It's just elusive, or he is just elusive, and these remarks just haunt the exposition and determine some of the language. Whereas in 1942, he goes directly to the remarks and some of the extremity of Hölderlin's thinking there. Now, in so doing, he is attending to something that Hölderlin discusses in the remarks, but also spoke about more explicitly in letters to his friend Casimir Ulrich Berlendorf. And these are a couple letters in which Hölderlin attempts to describe the relation between the Greeks and the Germans. And he sets up an extremely complex and somewhat obscure, but extremely complex chiasmic structure, whereby he says that the Greeks have, as proper to them in their being, a relation, or what he calls a holy pathos, a relation to the divine. And what is foreign to them, as he puts it in his language, is a clarity of representation, which he ascribes to the moderns as being their proper. So the Greeks have holy pathos as natural to them, clarity of representation as what they appropriate in order to find a way of bringing to language, of realizing their task of appropriating what is proper to them. The moderns, on the other hand, have as what is proper to them a clarity of presentation, a sober grasp and tendency to frame. This is Gestell. But they have, as in what is foreign to them, but what they require in order to begin to appropriate freely and fully their proper being, is what the Greeks had in the way of holy pathos. Now, what's a chiasmic structure? And Holonen says for that, we can't imitate the Greeks because the Greeks are working out a different relation between the proper and the foreign than we are, but we can learn from them. And Heidegger takes this over, and he says this in 1934, and then he says it again in 1942. He says, what the Germans really need is a bit more holy pathos. And he's, this is, I think he's already looking toward the notion of Gestell. He says, we're very good at framing, we're very good at setting things into concepts and, laying things out, but we get a little too caught up in that tendency. We need to appropriate the foreign, which is, or this other, which is a holy pathos. He will say the exact same thing in his Nietzsche lectures, where he says Nietzsche's concept of the Dionysian and the Apollonian brings a question to us that we must find a way of bringing into what he calls, I think at that moment, an historical style. We have to find this proper relation between the Nietzsche and the Dionysian and the Apollonian. He said the same thing more overtly and powerfully in relation to Holonen, who was basically working with the same notions. So what Heidegger is trying to do is get to the notion of holy pathos, and to think what in Sophocles, what in the Greeks can we learn about holy pathos, which is a relation to the divine, right? Or also a kind of native enthusiasm. So he's turning to Antigone to try to in part, he's trying to approach that question. This comes up again in 1942 when he said this in 35. It comes up again in 1942 when he's approaching the river hymns again, and he says what Holonen was thinking in the Easter, in this particular river hymn, is the relation between the home and the farm, the proper and the farm. And he reads in the movement of the river this journeying, as he calls it, or this homecoming. And he says that when Holonen is trying to think about becoming homely via becoming unhomely, or going toward the proper or the national via the foreign, he's doing what he's thinking at the same time of the Greeks, and he's thinking of Sophocles in particular. And so what's very striking here is that Heidegger appears to be trying to use this meditation on the Choral Ode in order to think about the nature of holy pathos, in which we have been reading as involving death. Now, the philia for death. As those of you who have some familiarity with Heidegger will know, from the existential analytic forward, Heidegger was trying to think our relation to human being from our relation to death. And in the existential analytic and being in time, this is very prominent. It takes a tragic construction, then it recedes. But nevertheless, it appears periodically and sometimes very gnomic kinds of phrasings. But it's clear that Heidegger understands the relation to death to be almost like a hinge for our possibility of having a relation to being. And he seems to be returning to this question of death via his interest in Antigone. And this is where the problem I'm trying to get at starts to appear. I don't think what he's describing is quite adequate, precisely to this question of death, which is the question for him for trying to understand the relation between being and human being. And so I'm going to, I'll say a few more words tomorrow about this to underscore to develop a bit further, what I tried to suggest yesterday is bringing me to this play, which is the possibility of some kind of remembrance of death. And this is why I will turn also to Blanchot tomorrow. And I'll say a few words about Lacan. I'll have to be swift. But I felt like I was able to cover a lot today. And I thank you for your patience. I'm gone 5 minutes over. I look forward to joining you tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining us.